My name is Meredith, a woman in her early 30s who recently lost everything in a bitter divorce. Instead of reacting weakly or screaming back at the cruel insults echoing across the room, I kept a quiet smile on my face while calmly plugging my storage device into the central projector system. A video lasting exactly 45 seconds began playing directly on the massive screen in the middle of the living room. It displayed crystal-clear images coupled with undeniable audio proving the disgusting betrayals committed by my sister. The entire spacious room instantly erupted into shocked whispers because the wealthy guests finally realized the horrifying truth. All color completely drained from my sister's face while she frantically stared at the undeniable evidence ruining her perfect facade. She panicked wildly while screaming at the top of her lungs in front of everyone, "Stop that right now!" I coldly looked straight into the trembling eyes of the cruel person who had just humiliated me without any mercy. With absolute composure, I confidently delivered the fatal question she had thrown at me moments ago. "How does it feel? Are you okay?" Before the chaos could fully unravel, I simply turned my back to walk away from that toxic environment forever. If you want to know the shocking secrets hidden behind that video, along with the unbelievable betrayal leading to this exact moment of sweet to hear the full story. The devastating tragedy officially began when my ex-husband Dean finally revealed his true nature of betrayal after several years of what I mistakenly thought was a deeply committed marriage. He ruthlessly filed the official divorce papers without offering any prior warning or attempting any mature discussion about the underlying issues destroying our relationship. At exactly 32 years old, I found myself being forcibly pushed out of the comfortable suburban home we had built together because his name was the only one legally listed on the property deed. Dean coldly handed me a printed eviction notice while aggressively shoving my folded clothes into cheap black garbage bags right in front of my face. He stared at me with absolute indifference while loudly declaring that I needed to find another place to live before the end of the week. The man I had loved for so long did not show a single ounce of guilt or hesitation while throwing me out onto the cold street. While desperately dragging myself through the exhausting legal procedures of a divorce settlement, a massive global restructuring swept through my corporate office and completely shattered my remaining stability. The human resources director abruptly called me into a sterile conference room to hand over my official termination letter, alongside a minimal severance package that would barely cover my most immediate living expenses. Losing my stable corporate career right in the middle of losing my marriage pushed me directly into a terrifying state of absolute financial ruin. I spent countless sleepless nights calculating my rapidly dwindling savings while staring blankly at the overwhelming stack of expensive legal bills piling up on my cheap motel desk. The horrifying reality of having absolutely zero income while fighting a losing legal battle thoroughly drained every ounce of my remaining physical and mental strength. Without any reliable source of income to afford the notoriously expensive rental market in our city, I was ultimately forced to abandon the familiar life I had known for over a decade. I carefully packed the few remaining personal belongings I had managed to salvage from the messy divorce into 2 battered suitcases and booked the absolute cheapest overnight bus ticket. The grueling 18-hour journey carried me far away from my ruined past toward an old historic neighborhood located in Boston, Massachusetts, where I desperately hoped to find some temporary shelter. I sat shivering in the back of that freezing public bus while watching the unfamiliar dark landscapes blur past the dirty window, feeling completely stripped of my personal dignity and independence. My entire existence had been tragically reduced to whatever fragile items could fit inside those 2 heavy bags resting quietly by my frozen feet. Having completely exhausted all my other viable options, I forcefully swallowed my remaining pride and knocked on the heavy wooden door belonging to the upscale apartment of my sister Daphne. She opened the door wearing an immaculate designer outfit, but her welcoming smile immediately vanished the second she saw my pathetic state, standing awkwardly in her pristine hallway. Daphne reluctantly dragged my battered suitcases inside, while loudly complaining about how my sudden arrival would completely disrupt her perfectly organized daily routine. She offered me a tiny sleeping space on the cramped leather sofa in her luxurious living room, with a deeply condescending attitude that made me feel like an incredibly unwanted burden. Daphne explicitly warned me not to touch any of her expensive decorative items or leave my personal belongings scattered around her meticulously decorated common areas. The crushing weight of my intense loneliness deepened significantly whenever my father and my mother decided to call the apartment during the late evening hours. Mom and Dad displayed complete apathy toward my devastating situation, never once bothering to ask how I was coping with the painful divorce or surviving the sudden job loss. Instead of offering any emotional support to their deeply struggling daughter, my parents constantly dominated the evening conversations by boasting about the recent promotions and financial successes Daphne had achieved at her corporate firm. I would lie quietly on that uncomfortable living room sofa while listening to Dad loudly praising Daphne through the speakerphone for being the absolute pride of our successful family. Their blatant favoritism cut much deeper than the divorce itself, because it solidified the incredibly painful realization that I was entirely alone in navigating this terrifying rock bottom. Several agonizing months slowly passed by after dragging my heavy suitcases into that suffocating Boston apartment. Daphne completely transformed my miserable existence into the grueling reality of a full-time unpaid maid expected to perfectly maintain her luxurious living space. She aggressively forced me to scrub her daily chaotic messes while systematically draining my rapidly depleting savings to cover the increasingly expensive household bills. Every single morning began with scrubbing sticky wine glasses or collecting the expensive designer clothes she carelessly discarded across the polished hardwood floors after another wild night out. I spent my precious remaining funds purchasing overpriced organic groceries just to satisfy her extremely demanding dietary preferences, without ever receiving a single word of gratitude in return for my exhausting efforts. The financial exploitation reached an absolute breaking point when I carefully questioned the sudden massive spikes appearing on our monthly utility statements during the freezing winter season. Daphne responded by coldly slamming the printed paper document onto the expensive glass coffee table while glaring at me with immense contempt radiating from her furious eyes. She crossed her arms defensively before snapping with a remarkably vicious tone. "Ever since you moved in here, the living expenses have increased significantly, so you need to know your place and pay for them." Her cruel words struck me deeply because I was actively rationing my own meager meals just to ensure her extravagant lifestyle remained perfectly uninterrupted by any minor financial inconveniences. I swallowed my burning resentment, silently returning to scrubbing the granite kitchen counters while closely observing the incredibly reckless reality of her carefully hidden private life. Daphne constantly maintained the flawless public image of a dedicated corporate professional, but her actual behavior behind closed doors revealed a remarkably chaotic and deceptive reality. I began noticing a highly disturbing pattern where several different strange men would awkwardly sneak out of our front door during the early morning hours every single month. She would casually dismiss their rushed departures while aggressively warning me to maintain absolute silence regarding her highly questionable romantic encounters with these random strangers. Living in that toxic environment required me to constantly turn a blind eye to the endless string of unfamiliar faces hastily buttoning their wrinkled shirts in our dimly lit hallway. The fragile dynamic within the apartment shifted permanently during a particularly chaotic weekend evening when Daphne stumbled through the front door heavily intoxicated and barely able to stand straight. She violently tossed her malfunctioning personal laptop directly onto my lap while aggressively slurring her demanding words across the quiet space of our dimly lit living room. She pointed a shaking manicured finger at the metallic device before loudly grumbling, "Fix this machine quickly for me. I have an extremely important meeting tomorrow that cannot go wrong under any circumstances." I cautiously opened the expensive computer, while silently praying that the internal software issues were simple enough for my previous technical background to resolve, without causing any further permanent damage. While carefully running the standard diagnostic programs to locate the underlying system errors, I accidentally clicked on a hidden messaging application she had carelessly left active on the main desktop. My eyes widened in absolute disgust as I scrolled through dozens of active group chats, fully exposing her highly calculated corporate sabotage against her own unsuspecting team members. The detailed text messages explicitly outlined her malicious strategies to blatantly steal innovative project ideas from her hard-working colleagues to falsely secure her own rapid promotions. She actively coordinated with other toxic individuals to claim full credit for massive departmental presentations that she had absolutely no part in actually researching or creating. The sickening revelations grew significantly worse when I stumbled upon a specific hidden folder containing incredibly vulgar insults specifically targeting her boss, Mr. Langley. Daphne had written pages of highly derogatory comments mocking his leadership abilities, while actively plotting to severely undermine his professional authority within the company boardrooms. Realizing the massive destructive power of these undeniable digital confessions, I immediately pulled a small data storage device from my winter jacket pocket with violently trembling hands. I meticulously copied every single incriminating chat log alongside those horrifying documents onto my personal flash drive to ensure her dirty secrets could never be erased or successfully denied in the future. An icy evening at the very beginning of November brought a sudden and dramatic shift to the heavy atmosphere within the apartment. Daphne pridefully organized an extravagant dinner at home to officially announce her upcoming marriage while gleefully introducing her successful fiancé to Mom and Dad through a large video call screen. She paraded the expensive engagement ring in front of the camera lens, while my parents showered her with endless praise for finally securing such a high-status match. I stood quietly in the background of the frame, ignored as usual, while the celebratory laughter of my family echoed painfully against the kitchen walls. The screen displayed the beaming faces of my parents, who seemed completely mesmerized by the glowing image of their seemingly perfect daughter and her wealthy future husband. The man sitting beside her, Sawyer, appeared to be a remarkably successful businessman who nevertheless radiated a genuine sense of calm and humble kindness that felt entirely out of place in that room. While Daphne remained occupied with making several boastful phone calls to her social circle, he quietly stepped away from the celebration to join me in the cluttered kitchen. He ignored the status gap between us and immediately began assisting me with the overwhelming pile of dirty dishes left over from the elaborate meal. Sawyer worked with a steady and unpretentious grace that made me feel like a human being for the first time in many agonizing months. His presence brought a temporary sense of peace to the kitchen that stood in stark contrast to the loud and superficial vanity occurring just a few feet away in the living room. He carefully poured a glass of warm water and handed it to me with a gentle smile that reached his eyes before asking about my well-being in a soft voice. Sawyer leaned against the granite counter while looking at me with genuine concern and said, "Daphne mentioned you are going through an incredibly difficult period lately. Have you started feeling any better? If you ever need any professional assistance finding a new job, please do not hesitate to reach out to me." His words were not filled with the typical pity I had come to expect from my family, but rather a sincere offer of support from one person to another. I clutched the warm glass tightly while struggling to find a response that would not betray the absolute chaos swirling deep inside my mind. The weight of his sincere kindness made me freeze in place, while an overwhelming sense of pity and sorrow for this decent man began to consume my heart. It felt deeply wrong that such a compassionate person was about to tie his entire life to a manipulative liar who cheated on him and plotted against her own colleagues. I looked at his honest face and wanted to scream the truth about the disgusting files currently hidden on my digital storage device just a few rooms away. The horrifying realization that he was being played for a fool by my own sister made the delicious dinner feel like bitter ash in my mouth. I couldn't understand how someone so perceptive could be so blind to the toxic rot hidden beneath Daphne's carefully maintained public facade. Unable to endure another second of the suffocatingly fake atmosphere inside the apartment, I quickly made a tired excuse to leave for some fresh air and contacted my best friend. I arranged to meet my best friend Blair at a quiet and secluded neighborhood cafe located just a few blocks away to finally release all the crushing pressure building up within my soul. The cold Boston wind bit at my cheeks as I walked rapidly toward the meeting spot, feeling the desperate need to speak with someone who truly saw me. I sat in a dim corner of the shop waiting for her arrival, my hands still trembling from the encounter with the man whose life was about to be ruined. After listening to my shaking voice recount the entire horrifying truth and carefully reviewing the digital evidence on the screen, Blair gripped my hand firmly to offer her strength. She looked me straight in the eyes with a serious expression and whispered her protective advice. You absolutely cannot reveal the truth right now, because they will simply claim you are acting out of bitter jealousy, so please be patient and wait for an undeniable public opportunity. Her logical words helped settle the frantic beating of my heart and allowed me to regain a small sense of mental clarity amidst the overwhelming deception. Blair stayed with me until the cafe closed, helping me process the heavy burden of the secret I was now forced to carry until the perfect moment for justice finally arrived. A freezing Christmas Eve enveloped all the streets covered in white snow, while the deceptive warmth of the Boston apartment was fueled by Daphne's obsession with social climbing. My sister decided to spend a massive fortune organizing an incredibly grand holiday gala, specifically designed to showcase her elevated status as the future wife of a wealthy man. She invited every single relative, close friend, and professional colleague, along with Mr. Langley, to witness her perceived success and influence within the elite social circles of the city. The living room was filled with expensive decorations and the scent of fine catering, while she floated through the crowd like a queen receiving her subjects. She spent the entire evening boasting about her upcoming wedding and her supposedly brilliant career achievements to anyone who would listen to her superficial stories. While every guest arrived wearing their most expensive designer dresses and tailored suits, I was cruelly forced to wear a set of old and faded clothes that made me look completely out of place. Daphne explicitly ordered me to stay out of the direct sight of the main guests unless I was actively carrying heavy trays of appetizers or pouring vintage wine for her demanding visitors. I spent several hours running back and forth between the cramped kitchen and the crowded party areas, while my feet throbbed with a dull ache from the relentless physical labor. My sister clearly enjoyed treating me like a low-level servant in front of the people who used to respect my previous professional accomplishments before my life fell apart. She would occasionally point toward me while whispering mocking comments to her friends about how she was charitably supporting her struggling and unfortunate sister. The immense physical exhaustion began to take a heavy toll on my ability to focus on the demanding tasks assigned to me during that chaotic evening. After several hours of working without a single break, my trembling hands finally lost their grip on a fragile crystal wine glass during a particularly crowded moment in the dining room. The glass slipped from my slick tray and shattered into 1,000 tiny pieces against the polished hardwood floor, while a dark spray of expensive red wine splashed across the white surface. A sudden and heavy silence fell over the immediate area as guests paused their conversations to stare at the messy accident. I stood frozen in absolute embarrassment while looking down at the red stains on my shoes, feeling the weight of dozens of judgmental eyes pressing down on my shoulders. Daphne immediately charged toward me across the room like a wild animal fueled by sudden and uncontrollable rage, while her face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. She reached me within seconds and delivered a violent slap across my left cheek that echoed loudly through the entire house, instantly cutting through the soft melodic music playing in the background. The force of her hand sent a sharp and stinging pain through my face, while my head snapped to the side from the sheer impact of the blow. The guests gasped in audible shock as they witnessed the brutal physical assault occurring right in the middle of the festive holiday celebration. Sawyer stepped forward with a look of horror on his face, but he was too late to prevent the sudden outburst of violence from his future bride. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my face while completely discarding her public image to scream, with a voice filled with bitter poison and arrogance. Daphne stood over me while I struggled to maintain my balance and yelled loudly enough for every single guest in the apartment to hear her cruel words clearly. She leaned in close to my ear and ranted with absolute contempt. How does it feel to always be the pathetic failure of this family who cannot even manage to hold a single wine glass properly? Her voice reached a fever pitch as she continued her public execution of my character. Your husband rightfully left you, you lost your miserable job, and now you are so utterly useless that you ruin my perfect evening with your clumsy incompetence. Her hateful speech continued for nearly 15 minutes, while she heartlessly dug into every single detail of my painful divorce to entertain her fascinated audience. She shared private details about my financial struggles and mocked my emotional vulnerability, while our parents stood quietly in the corner without making any attempt to stop her verbal assault. I stood perfectly still while listening to her turn my life's greatest tragedies into a series of cruel jokes for the amusement of her wealthy colleagues. While I slowly wiped the cold red wine from my cheek, a calm and absolute sense of clarity settled over my mind because I realized the time for mercy had officially passed. My sister had successfully destroyed any remaining shred of familial loyalty, so I silently prepared to deliver the digital evidence that would bring her entire world crashing down. Only 5 short minutes had passed after those cruel and venomous insults echoed through the silent house before I decided to take my final stand against the woman who had spent months destroying my dignity. Taking advantage of the chaotic moment while the stunned guests were still whispering among themselves about the shocking scene they had just witnessed, I quietly approached the central entertainment system. My heart was pounding violently against my ribs, yet my hands remained surprisingly steady as I decisively plugged my portable storage device into the high-end media processor, controlling the massive projector screen in the middle of the living room. I navigated the familiar interface with practiced speed, while ensuring that the volume was set high enough for every single person in the room to hear the truth clearly over their own hushed murmurs of confusion. The previously romantic and festive atmosphere of the elegant holiday party was immediately shattered by a high-definition video that began playing in front of the horrified audience. It displayed a series of crystal-clear recordings showing Daphne engaged in passionate and intimate encounters with multiple strange men at various hotels during the very same months she was supposedly devoted to Sawyer. The raw and undeniable footage played out on the giant screen while the guests watched in absolute silence, their faces reflecting a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity as they realized the woman they admired was a complete fraud. Every intimate detail was exposed for the entire social circle to see, stripping away her carefully crafted mask of virtue in a matter of seconds. Before the room could even begin to process the visual evidence of her romantic betrayal, the screen automatically shifted to a sharply detailed gallery of screenshots from her private messaging applications. These images clearly exposed her calculated schemes to maliciously steal innovative project ideas from her hard-working colleagues, while falsely claiming all the credit for her recent corporate promotions. The text logs also included several incredibly vulgar and unprofessional insults directed at Mr. Langley, revealing exactly how much she truly loathed the man currently standing just a few feet away from the projector. The documentation was so thorough and chronological that there was absolutely no room for anyone to doubt the malicious intent behind her professional rise. The brutal reality of her carefully constructed world falling apart caused Daphne to collapse into a state of total panic, while her face turned a sickly shade of pale that matched the winter snow outside. She frantically scrambled across the polished hardwood floor toward the electronic equipment, while screaming at the top of her lungs in a voice that was cracking with absolute desperation. She reached out with trembling hands to claw at the wires and shouted for everyone to hear, "Stop that right now and pull that device out immediately, because it is all a disgusting misunderstanding." Her eyes were wide with a terror I had never seen before, as she realized her reputation was being permanently incinerated in front of the people whose opinions she valued most. I stood my ground firmly like an immovable wall to block her from reaching the media console, while looking down at her frantic form with a cold and detached expression. I refused to let her silence the truth any longer, and replied with a voice that was as sharp and unforgiving as broken glass. "There is absolutely no misunderstanding here, so you should just stay back and let your fiancé and your boss see exactly who you really are until the very last second." I maintained my position with unwavering physical strength to ensure every single incriminating file played through to its completion, while the weight of her sins pressed down on the suffocating silence of the room. I felt no guilt or hesitation while watching her squirm on the floor, because she had brought this devastation upon herself through years of cruelty. Sawyer remained frozen in place like a statue, while the kind and gentle light that usually filled his eyes was replaced by a dark and terrifying wave of absolute fury. He watched the final images of her betrayal play out on the screen before slowly looking down at the woman he had intended to marry with a look of pure loathing. Without uttering a single word to her, he reached up with a shaking hand to rip the expensive engagement ring off his finger and threw it onto the polished glass coffee table with enough force to make the surface ring loudly. The heavy silence that followed was far more devastating than any scream, signaling the permanent end of their fraudulent relationship and the beginning of her ultimate downfall. The very moment that expensive engagement ring went rolling across the polished glass tabletop, the final shred of Daphne's carefully constructed world officially disintegrated into nothingness. Sawyer did not bother to cast even a single glance toward her as she knelt on the floor, because his disappointment had clearly turned into a cold and absolute resolve. He spoke in a hoarse voice, heavy with a profound sense of betrayal, while staring toward the dark hallway. "The wedding is completely finished right now, so do not ever think about trying to contact me again for the rest of your life." He turned his back on her without waiting for a response, and walked straight out of the front door into the freezing Boston night, without ever looking back at the wreckage he was leaving behind. The sound of the heavy door slamming shut echoed through the silent apartment like the final gavel of a judge delivering a life sentence. Daphne began sobbing uncontrollably while frantically scrambling to her feet to chase after the one person who could still save her professional reputation. She reached out with trembling fingers to grab the sleeve of Mr. Langley as he headed toward the coat rack, while trying to stammer out a series of desperate and nonsensical explanations. Her boss looked down at her with a face twisted in pure professional disgust, while he growled in a low and terrifying tone, "Get away from me, you pathetic liar, because I never want to see your face in my office ever again." He forcefully shoved her hand away with a violent motion that sent her stumbling backward against the wall, before he stormed out of the apartment in a state of absolute fury. The woman who had once been his top employee was now nothing more than a liability he intended to erase from his company history. The extravagant Christmas party that was supposed to be the crowning achievement of her social life was now nothing more than a hollow and embarrassing memory for everyone present. The large crowd of relatives and corporate colleagues began rushing toward the exit in a suffocatingly awkward silence, because nobody wanted to be associated with such a public and disgusting scandal. They avoided making eye contact with anyone while hastily grabbing their coats and disappearing into the darkness of the street as quickly as possible. The previously festive living room was now filled with the cold air coming through the open door and the lingering scent of expensive food that nobody had the stomach to eat anymore. All of her so-called friends vanished within minutes, leaving the apartment feeling empty and haunted by the echoes of their recent laughter. In a far corner of the silent room, Mom and Dad stood completely frozen like statues of stone, while their faces burned with an intense shade of crimson from the overwhelming shame of the moment. They were forced to face the horrifying reality that the daughter they had always prioritized and defended was actually a malicious manipulator who had deceived everyone around her for years. My parents could not even find the courage to look in my direction because they finally realized how much they had sacrificed and ignored just to protect her fraudulent image. The pride they had once felt for her was now replaced by a heavy and suffocating sense of humiliation that would likely haunt them for the rest of their lives. They stood there in total silence, unable to offer a single word of comfort to the daughter who had lost everything, or the daughter who had exposed it. Daphne ultimately collapsed onto the hardwood floor, which was now messy with shattered glass and dark stains of spilled red wine that looked like blood under the holiday lights. She buried her face in her manicured hands and began wailing with a primal sound of absolute despair while surrounded by the ruins of her fame and wealth. Everything she had worked so hard to steal or manipulate from others had been stripped away in a matter of minutes, leaving her with nothing but the crushing weight of her own actions. The glittering decorations around her now seemed like a cruel mockery of the life she had just permanently destroyed through her own arrogance and greed. She was no longer the successful woman who had it all but a broken figure lying in the middle of a self-inflicted disaster. I took several slow and deliberate steps across the room until I was standing directly in front of the broken woman who had spent months treating me like a worthless servant. I leaned down slightly to look directly into her swollen and tear-streaked eyes while maintaining a perfectly calm and detached expression on my face. With a voice that was quiet, yet filled with the cold weight of justice, I calmly repeated the exact question she had used to humiliate me earlier. "How does it feel to be the failure of the family? Are you okay?" I did not wait for her to respond to my words before I turned around to walk toward the guest room to pack the remaining items in my battered suitcases so I could leave this toxic house forever. A full 2 months have finally passed since that chaotic Christmas party turned into a public execution of a reputation built entirely on lies and corporate theft. The actual consequences arrived like a devastating hurricane that swept away every single luxury Daphne had ever possessed or manipulated from others. Mr. Langley officially terminated her employment the very next morning after carefully reviewing the undeniable digital proof of her consistent plagiarism and professional sabotage. Word of her unethical behavior spread rapidly through the entire industry because Boston is a surprisingly small world for high-level corporate professionals. She found herself completely blacklisted from every major firm in the city, with no hope of ever regaining her previous status or salary. Without the massive income she once relied upon, she was forced to face the horrifying reality of a crushing mountain of credit card debt. Every single expensive designer item she had purchased to impress her social circle became a painful reminder of her absolute financial ruin. She eventually had to abandon her upscale lifestyle and move back into the small guest room of our parents' house, while living under the heavy weight of their silent disappointment. Her daily life now consists of answering calls from debt collectors, while watching the world she once dominated continue to move forward without her presence. She now lives in the very guest room she once mocked me for needing, while I have moved on to a future she can no longer touch. On that very same Christmas night, I carried my battered suitcases out of that toxic apartment and never once looked back at the wreckage of my old life. I walked through the freezing snow to the nearest bus station and purchased a one-way ticket to a city where nobody knew my name or my past tragedies. Before the bus even crossed the state line, I systematically blocked every single phone number and social media profile belonging to Daphne mom and dad. I established an absolute and permanent boundary of zero contact because I finally understood that shared DNA is never a valid excuse for enduring psychological abuse or financial exploitation. There were no dramatic goodbye letters or tearful explanations left behind, because my silence was the most powerful statement I could possibly make after months of being silenced myself. I chose to prioritize my own mental health and future over the empty obligations of a family that had consistently chosen a liar over the truth. The heavy burden of their favoritism and cruelty vanished the moment I turned off my phone and watched the city lights of Boston fade into the distance. I felt a strange and beautiful sense of lightness that I had not experienced since the day my marriage first began to crumble. Relying on the inner strength I had built during my darkest hours, I managed to secure an incredible new position at a thriving tech company in a different state within just a week. I rented a small but beautifully sunlight-filled apartment that finally felt like a genuine sanctuary rather than a temporary prison cell of resentment. My new life is defined by a profound sense of peace and the absolute freedom that comes with being entirely independent of everyone else's expectations. I spent my first full paycheck on high-quality furniture and a security system that provides me with a deep sense of safety I had not felt in years. Financial independence has become my most trusted shield, ensuring that I will never again be forced to beg for shelter or endure the cruelty of manipulative relatives. I often spend my quiet evenings looking out at the city skyline, while feeling an immense wave of gratitude for the courage I found to reclaim my own existence. The scars from my past are still there, but they no longer define my value or dictate how I choose to spend my days in this peaceful new chapter. Before ending today's story, let us take a moment to reflect on the profound lessons hidden within this intense journey of betrayal and redemption from a broader perspective. It is absolutely vital to realize that no one should ever feel obligated to endure constant toxicity or exploitation simply because the person hurting them happens to be a family member. Daphne's downfall serves as a powerful reminder that a life built on lies and the suffering of others will eventually collapse under the weight of its own deception. Meredith's decision to choose herself and walk away from the chaos proves that setting firm boundaries is an act of survival rather than an act of cruelty. Now, I want to hear your thoughts on this situation because your unique perspective truly matters to our growing community. If you were in Meredith's position, would you have chosen to walk away forever, or would you have eventually offered a chance for reconciliation? Please share your opinions and any similar experiences in the comments below. And don't